The wrench slipped from Tom's greasy fingers and clanged against the metal floor of Maintenance Bay 7. He cursed under his breath and wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a dark smear across his skin. The atmospheric recycler had been acting up again, making strange grinding noises that kept him awake at night. 3 years on Epsilon 7 mining station had taught him to recognize every sound the old machinery made, and this was definitely not normal. Tom crawled deeper into the narrow service tunnel, his headlamp cutting through the darkness. The station groaned around him like a living thing, metal expanding and contracting as it orbited the massive gas giant below. He had grown to love these sounds over the years. They meant home, safety, and honest work fixing things that needed fixing. The comm system crackled to life above his head, making him jump and bang his skull against a pipe. All personnel report to stations immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel report to stations. Tom frowned and backed out of the tunnel. Commander Reese never called emergency meetings unless something was seriously wrong. The last time had been when pirates tried to raid their ore shipments 6 months ago. He grabbed his toolkit and jogged toward the command center, his boots echoing in the empty corridors. The station felt different today. Usually the halls buzzed with activity as mining crews prepared for their shifts and transport ships came and went. Now everything seemed too quiet, too still. Even the alien workers looked nervous, their various species all showing signs of distress in their own ways. Tom arrived at the command center to find chaos. Officers rushed between workstations while screens flashed with data he could not understand. Commander Reese stood at the center of it all, her face grim as she studied a tactical display showing the local star system. "Listen up, everyone," Reese called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "Long-range sensors have detected a hegemony, fleet approaching our position. 30 ships, including at least 6 heavy cruisers. Estimated arrival time is 14 hours. A cold feeling settled in Tom's stomach. The Hegemony Empire had been pushing deeper into Coalition space for months, conquering world after world with their advanced technology and ruthless tactics. Epsilon 7 was supposed to be too far from the front lines to matter. All non-essential. Personnel will evacuate immediately, Reese continued. Transport ships are already being prepared. Essential staff will remain to destroy sensitive data and equipment before final evacuation in 8 hours. Tom raised his hand. "Commander, what about the quantum transmitter array? If the hegemony captures our communication logs, they'll know the locations of every coalition fleet in this sector." Reese nodded grimly. "The transmitter will be destroyed along with everything else. We cannot let that information fall into enemy hands." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Tom helped load the transport ships with evacuees, watching as families and friends said their goodbyes. The alien workers seemed especially frightened, having heard stories of what the hegemony did to conquered species. Their fear was not without reason. As the last civilian transport departed, Tom found himself in the transmitter control room, staring at the massive array of equipment that kept the station connected to the rest of the galaxy. The quantum transmitter was a marvel of engineering, capable of sending messages across vast distances instantly. It also contained detailed records of every coalition military communication that had passed through the station. "Brady, you need to get to the evacuation bay," Commander Reese said from behind him. "The final transport leaves in 1 hour." Tom turned around, his mind racing. "Commander, I've been thinking about the transmitter. Instead of just destroying it, what if we could wipe the data and send it to Coalition Command? The fleet movement, schedules, supply routes, defensive positions, all of it could help them prepare for the hegemony advance." Reese shook her head. "The transmitter array is too damaged from our preparation for demolition. It would take days to repair, and we have less than 6 hours before the enemy arrives. What if someone stayed behind to fix it?" The commander's eyes widened. "That's suicide, Brady. Once the hegemony gets here, anyone left on this station is dead." Tom looked back at the transmitter array, his engineer's mind already working through the problems. Maybe, or maybe not. This station has defensive systems that nobody ever uses, mining lasers that could be weapons, gravity generators that could be traps. I know every inch of this place, every system, every backup circuit. One person against 30 warships? That's impossible. Maybe, Tom said again, but his voice carried a strange certainty. But if I can get that data transmitted, it might save millions of lives. And someone has to try. Reese stared at him for a long moment. I can't order you to stay, Brady. This is your choice. Tom nodded. I know. The commander reached into her pocket and pulled out her command authorization. Codes. If you're really going to do this, you'll need access to all station systems. Everything from weapons to life support. Tom took the codes with hands that did not shake. Thank you, Commander. The final transport ship departed exactly on schedule, carrying Commander Reese and the last of the essential personnel to safety. Tom watched from the observation deck as the small vessel disappeared into the darkness of space, leaving him completely alone on a station designed to house 3,000 people. He walked slowly back to the transmitter control room, the silence pressing against his ears like a physical weight. The quantum array lay partially disassembled, its components scattered across workbenches where the demolition crew had been preparing to destroy it. Tom rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The first step was reconnecting the primary power couplings that had been deliberately severed. Tom's hands moved with practiced efficiency, guided by 3 years of maintaining the station's systems. Every wire had its place, every circuit its purpose. This was what he did best. As he worked, Tom's mind wandered to his family back on Earth. His sister would be proud of what he was doing, though she would probably call him crazy for staying behind. His parents would worry, but they would understand. The Brady family had always believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. Hours passed as Tom repaired and modified the transmitter array. The work was slow and delicate, requiring him to rebuild systems that had been designed for destruction. But gradually, the array began to come back to life. Status lights flickered on, and the familiar hum of quantum field generators filled the room. Tom glanced at the chronometer on the wall. The hegemony fleet would arrive in less than 2 hours. He had managed to restore basic transmitter function, but encoding and sending all the data would take at least 3 more hours. He was going to have company before the job was finished. He stood up and stretched his aching back, then walked to the nearest weapons control panel. Time to see what an old mining station could do against the most feared fleet in the galaxy. Tom smiled grimly as he began activating systems that had never been used in combat. Losing had never been an option, he considered. Someone had to hold the line. The first enemy ship appeared as a distant speck against the swirling clouds of the gas giant below. Tom watched it through the observation window while sipping coffee from a mug that read, "Galaxy's Best Engineer." The irony was not lost on him. In about 30 minutes, he would find out just how good an engineer he really was. Tom had spent the last hour preparing for battle in ways the station's designers never intended. The massive ore processing lasers, normally used to cut through asteroids, were now aimed at space. The gravity generators that kept the station's rotation stable had been modified to create localized fields that could crush anything that got too close. Even the garbage disposal system had been turned into a weapon, ready to fire compressed waste packages at enemy ships. The quantum transmitter hummed behind him, slowly encoding 3 years' worth of coalition military data. The process could not be rushed, and Tom estimated he needed at least 2 more hours to complete the transmission. That meant holding off 30 hegemony warships for 2 hours with nothing but mining equipment and his own stubborn refusal to give up. More ships appeared in the distance, their sleek black hulls reflecting the light of the distant star. Tom counted them through the telescopic viewer, marking each vessel type on a piece of paper. 28 ships total, including 6 heavy cruisers that could probably destroy the station with a single volley. The odds were not in his favor. His comm system crackled to life with an incoming transmission. Tom hesitated, then accepted the call. A harsh alien voice filled the control room, speaking accented Coalition standard. "Unknown vessel, this is Admiral Krovex of the Hegemony Third Fleet. You will surrender immediately and prepare for boarding. Any resistance will result in the destruction of your station and the execution of all personnel." Tom picked up the microphone and cleared his throat. "This is Tom Brady, currently in charge of Epsilon 7 mining station. I'm afraid I can't surrender, Admiral. I'm a bit busy right now." There was a long pause. "Human, you are alone on that station. Our sensors detect only one life sign. Surrender now and you will be treated according to the laws of war." "Thanks for the offer," Tom replied, "but I think I'll pass. Besides, I've got work to finish here." Another pause, longer this time. "You cannot seriously intend to fight an entire fleet by yourself." Tom looked around the control room at all the improvised weapon systems he had spent the morning rigging together. "Actually, Admiral, that's exactly what I intend to do." The transmission cut off abruptly. Tom watched through the viewer as the Hegemony fleet began to spread out into an attack formation. They were being cautious, probably wondering if the human was insane or if this was some kind of trap. Both answers were partially correct. The first attack came from the smallest ships, fast fighters that darted in to test the station's defenses. Tom waited until they were within range of the mining lasers, then opened fire. The massive industrial beams designed to slice through solid rock tore through the fighters' armor like paper. 3 ships exploded in brilliant flashes before the survivors retreated. Tom allowed himself a small smile. The Hegemony had expected to find a defenseless mining station. Instead, they were facing a fortress that fought back with deadly precision. The enemy regrouped and tried a different approach. A squadron of medium cruisers moved in from multiple directions, firing missiles and energy weapons at the station's hull. Tom activated the gravity generators he had modified, creating powerful fields that crushed incoming missiles and deflected energy beams. The station shook under the assault, but its thick hull held firm. Using the ore processing systems, Tom began firing back with chunks of refined metal accelerated to incredible speeds. The kinetic projectiles punched through enemy shields and hull plating, sending 2 cruisers spiraling away with massive holes in their sides. The remaining ships pulled back to regroup again. Admiral Krovex's voice came through the comm system. Again, this time sounding frustrated and angry. "Human, you are only delaying the inevitable. We have 30 ships and you have 1 mining station. Mathematics is not on your side." Tom was busy rerouting power from life support to weapons, accepting that he had limited time but could cause maximum damage. "Admiral, I was never very good at math. I always preferred engineering." To prove his point, Tom fired up the station's mass driver, normally used to launch cargo containers toward transport ships. Instead of cargo, he loaded it with mining explosives and launched them at the nearest Hegemony cruiser. The improvised bombs detonated against the ship's hull, sending it tumbling out of control. The Hegemony fleet pulled back to a safe distance, while their commanders tried to figure out how a single human on a mining station was causing so much damage. Tom used the brake to check on the quantum transmitter. Still an hour and a half to go. He needed to buy more time. The next attack came from all directions at once. Every Hegemony ship opened fire simultaneously, filling space around the station with missiles, energy beams, and kinetic rounds. Tom's modified gravity generators worked overtime, crushing or deflecting most of the incoming fire, but some got through. Explosions rocked the station as sections of the outer hull were torn away. Tom felt the station shudder around him and knew he was running out of time. The defensive systems he had jury-rigged were impressive, but they were never designed for this kind of sustained combat. He needed a new strategy. Looking at his control panels, Tom noticed something interesting. The hegemony ships were maintaining formation, staying close together for mutual support. That gave him an idea. He began overloading the station's fusion reactor, not to create an explosion, but to generate a massive electromagnetic pulse. The process was dangerous and required precise timing. Too little power and the pulse would be ineffective. Too much, and the reactor would explode, taking him and the quantum transmitter with it. Tom's hands moved across the controls with steady precision, his engineering training guiding him through calculations that could mean the difference between victory and death. The hegemony fleet moved in for what they clearly intended to be the final assault. All 30 ships advanced in perfect formation, their weapons charging for a coordinated strike that would overwhelm even Tom's improvised defenses. Tom watched them approach and smiled grimly. They were about to learn that humans had a talent for turning disadvantages into opportunities. He placed his finger over the reactor overload control and waited for exactly the right moment. "Come on," he whispered to himself. "Just a little. Closer." The quantum transmitter continued its work behind him, slowly uploading the data that would help the coalition prepare for the coming war. Tom just needed to hold the line a little longer. The hegemony fleet was about to discover that defeating a stubborn human engineer was much harder than their tactical computers had calculated. Outside the observation window, 30 enemy warships prepared to destroy what they thought was a helpless mining station. They had no idea that Tom Brady was just getting started. Tom's finger hovered over the reactor overload button as 30 hegemony warships closed in for their final attack. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and they would have time to retreat. Too late, and their combined firepower would turn him into space dust before he could complete his plan. The lead cruiser was now close enough that Tom could see individual weapon ports along its hull. Energy readings spiked across his displays as every enemy ship prepared to fire simultaneously. This was it. Tom slammed his hand down on the overload control and held his breath. The station's fusion reactor screamed in protest as power levels jumped far beyond safe limits. Warning alarms blared throughout the control room, but Tom ignored them. He watched the energy buildup readings climb higher and higher until they reached the critical threshold he had calculated. A brilliant pulse of electromagnetic energy exploded outward from Epsilon 7, washing over the approaching hegemony fleet like an invisible wave. Every enemy ship that had been charging weapons suddenly went dark. Their engines cut out, their shields collapsed, and their communication systems died. 30 advanced warships were now floating helplessly in space, their crews trapped inside metal coffins. Tom allowed himself exactly 3 seconds to enjoy the victory before getting back to work. The electromagnetic pulse had also damaged many of his own systems, and he could hear the fusion reactor struggling to return to normal operation. Worse, he could see through the observation window that some of the smaller hegemony ships were already beginning to restart their engines. The pulse had bought him time, but not as much as he had hoped. The quantum transmitter was still running, but slower now due to power fluctuations. Tom estimated another hour before the data upload would be complete. That meant he needed to find new ways to keep the enemy fleet disabled or distracted. He grabbed his toolkit and headed for the maintenance tunnels. If the hegemony managed to get their ships running again, they would probably try to board the station rather than risk another long-range attack. Tom intended to make sure any boarding parties would regret their decision. The maintenance tunnels ran throughout the station like a complex maze, connecting every major system and providing access to critical components. Tom knew these passages better than anyone, having spent 3 years crawling through them to fix problems. Now they would become his highways for moving around the station unseen. Tom's first stop was the docking bay control room. Using his engineering access codes, he reprogrammed the automated systems to treat any unauthorized vessel as contaminated cargo. When hegemony boarding craft tried to dock, they would be grabbed by the station's loading arms and crushed like empty cans. The bay's industrial equipment was designed to handle massive ore containers, so it could easily deal with smaller military vehicles. Next, he modified the atmospheric processing system. Instead of maintaining breathable air throughout the station, Tom programmed it to flood certain sections with various gases from the processing tanks. Some areas would be filled with nitrogen that would make intruders sleepy and confused. Others would get carbon dioxide that would cause panic and disorientation. A few special corridors would receive a mixture of industrial solvents that would eat through most armor materials. The gravity generators offered even more creative possibilities. Tom programmed them to create random gravitational fields throughout the station. Corridors that seemed normal would suddenly slam intruders against the ceiling or walls with crushing force. Rooms would become deadly traps where the artificial gravity could be increased to 5 times normal, making movement almost impossible. As Tom worked his way through the maintenance tunnels, modifying system after system, he could hear the distant sound of hegemony engines coming back online. The electromagnetic pulse had given him perhaps 30 minutes of breathing room, but now the enemy was recovering. Time to see how well his preparations would work. The first boarding craft approached, the main docking bay with typical hegemony arrogance. Tom watched through security cameras as the sleek assault shuttle moved confidently toward the station's loading ports. The automated systems he had reprogrammed responded exactly as planned. Massive mechanical arms reached out and grabbed the boarding craft, then began applying crushing pressure. The shuttle's hull cracked and split as its crew realized, too late, that they had flown into a trap. More boarding craft tried different approaches, but Tom had prepared for that too. Shuttles that tried to land in the cargo bays were met by mining. Robots reprogrammed for combat. The industrial machines, designed to move tons of ore, made short work of enemy soldiers in their bulky armor suits. Boarding parties that tried to cut through the station's hull found themselves facing automated welding torches that turned their own weapons against them. But the hegemony were persistent, and eventually some of their troops managed to get inside the station. Tom tracked their progress through internal sensors as they spread out in search of him and the quantum transmitter. What they found instead were corridors that had become deadly obstacle courses. A squad of hegemony soldiers entered Section 7 and immediately began choking as the atmosphere filled with carbon dioxide. They retreated quickly, but ran straight into Section 6, where the gravity suddenly increased to 3 times normal. 2 soldiers collapsed under the weight of their own equipment while the others struggled to move. Another team tried to reach the command center through the main corridors, but found themselves trapped in a maze where every turn led to new dangers. Floors became slippery as industrial lubricants leaked from hidden pipes. Walls sparked with electrical discharges from damaged power conduits. Ceiling panels fell without warning. Triggered by motion sensors Tom had connected to the mining explosive system. Admiral Krovex's voice crackled over the emergency comm channels, his earlier arrogance replaced by frustrated anger. "Human, your tricks cannot last forever. We have more troops than your station has rooms. Eventually we will find you." Tom was crouched in a maintenance shaft above the quantum transmitter room, watching enemy soldiers try to navigate the maze he had created below. "Admiral, you're probably right about that. But I don't need forever. I just need about 45 more minutes." The truth was that Tom's improvised defenses were working better than he had dared hope. The hegemony troops were trained to fight enemies who followed conventional military tactics. They had no experience dealing with an opponent who turned every system in a space station into a potential weapon. Their advanced armor and weapons were useless against traps they could not predict or understand. Tom crawled through the maintenance shaft to his next position, where he had prepared another surprise for the invaders. The station's waste processing system normally handled garbage and sewage from 3,000 residents. With some creative reprogramming, it could handle a few dozen hegemony soldiers just as efficiently. Below him, enemy troops were finally making progress toward the quantum transmitter room. They had learned to move slowly and carefully, checking every surface and system for hidden dangers. Their caution was understandable but costly in terms of time. Every minute they spent being careful was another minute for the data upload to continue. Tom smiled as he watched them inch forward through the corridors. The hegemony had probably never fought an enemy who refused to engage in direct combat. Their tactical training assumed opponents would eventually make a stand and fight in the open. They had no protocols for dealing with someone who simply refused to lose, no matter how impossible the odds appeared. The quantum transmitter's progress indicator showed 37 minutes remaining. Tom checked his improvised traps and weapons one more time. The hardest part was yet to come. Soon the enemy would reach the transmitter room itself, and Tom would have to make his final stand. But he had spent the last hour making sure that, when that moment came, he would be ready. The hegemony was about to learn that cornering a human engineer was very different from defeating one. The maintenance shaft felt smaller than usual as Tom crawled toward his final defensive position. Behind him, he could hear the steady progress of hegemony troops as they worked their way through his maze of traps and obstacles. They had learned to be cautious after losing half their boarding parties to his improvised defenses, but they were still coming. Tom emerged from the shaft into a storage room adjacent to the quantum transmitter chamber. 23 minutes remained on the upload timer. 23 minutes to hold off professional soldiers with nothing but spare parts and engineering knowledge. He had faced worse odds before, though he could not remember when. The storage room contained supplies for maintaining the transmitter array. Tom quickly gathered everything useful and began assembling his final collection of weapons and traps. A plasma torch became a short-range flamethrower. Magnetic clamps turned into proximity mines. Even the emergency medical supplies were pressed into service as he mixed chemicals that would create smoke screens and temporary blindness. His greatest advantage was still his intimate knowledge of the station's systems. Tom had spent 3 years fixing every component, upgrading every circuit, and learning every quirk of the massive facility. The hegemony soldiers were fighting in unfamiliar territory against an enemy who treated the entire station as an extension of his own body. Through the walls, Tom could hear enemy troops reaching the corridor outside the transmitter chamber. They were moving slowly and systematically, checking every panel and junction for hidden surprises. Their caution was smart but time-consuming. Each minute they spent being careful was another minute of precious data flowing toward Coalition forces. Tom activated his final set of environmental traps. The corridor outside began filling with a mixture of industrial gases that would make breathing difficult without full environmental suits. The lighting system started flickering in patterns designed to cause disorientation and headaches. Even the temperature controls were weaponized, creating zones of extreme heat and cold that would force the attackers to move in predictable patterns. The first explosion echoed through the walls as hegemony troops triggered one of Tom's magnetic mines. Shouts of anger and confusion followed as the survivors realized they were walking through another deadly obstacle course. Tom smiled grimly as he listened to their radio chatter. They were starting to sound frustrated and scared. Admiral Krovex's voice cut through the tactical communications with typical hegemony arrogance. "Breach teams, what is your status? The human is one man with maintenance tools. How are you having difficulty?" The response came through static and interference. "Admiral, this human has turned the entire station into a weapon. Every corridor is trapped. Every system fights against us. It is like fighting a ghost that controls reality itself." Tom almost laughed at that description. A ghost that controls reality. He liked it. In a way, that was exactly what he had become. The station responded to his will because he understood it completely. Every pipe, every wire, every circuit was an extension of his thoughts and intentions. 15 minutes left on the transmission timer. Tom could hear cutting torches working. On the transmitter room door, the hegemony had given up trying to move quickly and were now simply burning their way through every obstacle. It was slow work, but effective. Soon they would break through, and Tom would have to face them directly. He positioned himself behind a barricade of equipment cases and checked his improvised weapons one final time. The plasma torch was fully charged and ready to fire. His magnetic clamp mines were positioned to create a crossfire pattern. Chemical smoke canisters were placed to provide cover and concealment. Everything was as ready as it could be. The cutting torch finally burned through the door, and the first hegemony soldier stepped into the transmitter chamber. Tom let him advance 3 steps before triggering the first mine. The magnetic explosion sent the soldier flying backward into his companions, buying Tom a few precious seconds. Smoke filled the room as Tom activated his chemical canisters. Through the haze, he could see enemy troops trying to establish firing positions while dealing with poor visibility and confusing acoustics. Tom used his knowledge of the room's layout to move between cover positions, appearing and disappearing like the ghost the soldiers had described. The plasma torch proved devastatingly effective in close quarters, its industrial-grade beam cut through military armor like paper, forcing the hegemony troops to keep their distance. But Tom knew he could not hold them off much longer. They had numbers and superior weapons. He had determination and intimate knowledge of the battlefield. 10 minutes left on the transmission. Tom triggered another set of environmental controls, flooding the room with nitrogen gas that would make the enemy troops drowsy and slow to react. Their environmental suits would protect them eventually, but for a few minutes they would be fighting at reduced capacity. A hegemony grenade exploded near Tom's position, sending equipment fragments flying in all directions. He felt something sharp cut across his left arm, but ignored the pain. There was no time to worry about minor injuries. The quantum transmitter continued its steady work behind him, uploading data that would help save millions of lives. More soldiers poured into the chamber as Tom fell back toward the transmitter array itself. This was his final position, the place where he would make his last stand. The massive quantum field generators hummed around him like protective totems, their energy fields creating interference that made enemy targeting difficult. Tom grabbed a spare power cell and began overcharging it with a maintenance tool. The improvised explosive would not be large, but it would be precisely placed. If the hegemony wanted to capture the transmitter, they would have to get past a human who had turned desperation into an art form. 7 minutes remaining. Tom could see enemy soldiers closing in from 3 directions. Their commander was shouting orders in the hegemony language, probably telling them to take the human alive for interrogation. Tom had no intention of accommodating that request. He triggered his last set of magnetic mines, sending more soldiers scrambling for cover. The plasma torch in his hands spat deadly energy at anything that moved. Around him, the quantum transmitter continued its vital work, indifferent to the battle, raging in its shadow. A shot from an enemy weapon grazed Tom's shoulder, spinning him around and nearly knocking him down. He steadied himself against one of the transmitter's support columns and kept fighting. Pain was just another system malfunction to be ignored until more important work was finished. 5 minutes left. Tom could feel exhaustion creeping into his muscles, but his mind remained sharp and focused. The hegemony soldiers were being more cautious now, having learned to respect his improvised weapons and traps. Their caution was buying him time, but it also meant they were learning his patterns. Tom looked at the transmission timer and made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of continuing to fight defensively, he grabbed his overcharged power cell and went on the attack. The hegemony soldiers had never expected their trapped prey to suddenly become the hunter. The improvised explosive detonated in the middle of an enemy squad, sending them diving for cover and disrupting their coordinated advance. Tom used the confusion to reposition himself near the room's main power junction. If he could overload the station's electrical grid at just the right moment, he might be able to create one final surprise for his attackers. 3 minutes left on the transmission. Tom's fingers flew over the power controls, setting up a feedback loop that would turn every metal surface in the room into a conductor for a massive electrical discharge. The timing would have to be perfect, and he would only get one chance. The hegemony soldiers regrouped and prepared for their final assault. Tom waited behind the transmitter array, his hand poised over the electrical overload control. 23 minutes had passed since the enemy first breached the transmitter chamber. In 3 more minutes, the coalition would have everything. They needed to fight back effectively. Tom smiled as he realized he was actually going to succeed. Against impossible odds, using nothing but spare parts and determination, he was going to complete his mission. The hegemony was about to learn that humans had a very inconvenient habit of winning battles they were supposed to lose. 2 minutes and 37 seconds remained on the transmission timer when Tom made peace with the fact that he was probably going to die. The hegemony soldiers had him surrounded, their weapons trained on his position behind the quantum transmitter array. His improvised defenses were exhausted, his plasma torch was empty, and his left arm hung useless at his side from an enemy shot. But the data was still uploading. Coalition fleet positions, supply routes, defensive strategies, and hegemony. Tactical analysis flowed through the quantum channels toward friendly forces throughout the galaxy. Every second the transmission continued was another piece of information that could save lives and win battles. Tom looked at the enemy soldiers advancing toward him and felt something he had not expected. Not fear or regret, but a strange sense of satisfaction. He had held the line. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he had accomplished his mission against impossible odds. The stubborn human engineer had refused to lose when losing would have been so much easier. The transmission timer showed 2 minutes remaining when Tom activated his final surprise. Instead of the electrical overload he had prepared, he triggered something much more dramatic. The station's fusion reactor, still unstable from his earlier electromagnetic pulse, received new instructions that pushed it far beyond any safe operating parameters. Tom was not trying to create an explosion. That would destroy the transmitter and waste everything he had accomplished. Instead, he was creating a controlled overload that would generate another electromagnetic pulse, but this time focused and directed at the hegemony fleet still floating, helplessly in space. The reaction began deep in the station's core as fusion plasma temperatures spiked beyond the reactor's design limits. Warning alarms screamed throughout the facility as automated systems tried desperately to prevent what they assumed was a catastrophic malfunction. Tom ignored the alerts and continued his precise adjustments, balancing energy output like a conductor directing a very dangerous orchestra. 1 minute and 58 seconds left on the transmission. The hegemony soldiers seemed confused by the alarms and flashing lights, unsure whether to continue their assault or retreat from what might be an imminent explosion. Their hesitation gave Tom the breathing room he needed to complete his reactor modifications. The electromagnetic pulse erupted outward from Epsilon 7 with 10 times the power of Tom's earlier attempt. Every hegemony ship in the local area went completely dark as their electrical systems were overwhelmed by the focused energy wave. But this time, Tom had designed the pulse to do more than just disable enemy vessels. The directed electromagnetic burst also carried a message. Hidden within the energy patterns was a detailed tactical analysis of hegemony fleet movements transmitted on coalition emergency frequencies. Any friendly ship within 50 light-years would receive both the original data upload and Tom's real-time intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. 1 minute and 23 seconds remaining on the main transmission. Tom slumped against the transmitter array, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The reactor pulse had drained most of the station's remaining power, leaving only emergency lighting and life support systems active. The hegemony soldiers advanced cautiously through the dimly lit chamber, their weapons ready, but their confidence clearly shaken. Admiral Krovex's voice crackled over the emergency comm system, filled with frustration and grudging respect. "Human, you have fought well, but it is over. Surrender now and I promise you will be treated with honor. Tom looked at the transmission timer. 57 seconds left. Admiral, I appreciate the offer, but I'm still working here. Could you ask your people to keep it down? I'm trying to concentrate. The hegemony commander's response was a mixture of anger and disbelief. You cannot seriously intend to continue this madness. Your station is dying around you. Your weapons are exhausted. What more can you possibly accomplish? Tom managed a tired smile as he watched the data upload progress indicator creep toward completion. Admiral, you've been fighting humans long. Enough to know we're all a little crazy. We don't know when to quit. 32 seconds remaining. The hegemony soldiers were now close enough that Tom could see their faces through their helmet visors. They looked tired and frustrated, having lost more troops to one human engineer than they had in most planetary invasions. Their weapons were trained on him, but they seemed reluctant to fire while he was so close to the transmitter equipment. 21 seconds left. Tom reached into his toolkit and pulled out his last surprise. A simple emergency beacon, the kind used to signal for rescue during mining accidents. He had modified it with components from the station's navigation system, turning it into a quantum resonance transmitter. When activated, it would send a signal that any coalition ship could track directly to Epsilon 7. The lead hegemony soldier shouted an order for Tom to step away from the transmitter. Tom looked at him and shook his head. Sorry, but I've got a job to finish here. 15 seconds remaining on the transmission timer. Tom activated his modified beacon and felt it connect with the quantum field generated by the main transmitter array. The signal would carry across the galaxy, marking the exact location of the disabled hegemony fleet for any coalition forces in the area. 10 seconds. The quantum transmitter's final data packets flowed through the communication channels, carrying the last pieces of intelligence that would help the coalition prepare for the continuing war. Tom watched the progress indicator with satisfaction, knowing that his 3-year assignment on a forgotten mining station had turned into something that might change the course of galactic history. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. The transmission, completed with a soft chime that seemed almost anticlimactic after hours of desperate battle. Tom looked at the hegemony soldiers surrounding him and smiled. Gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The upload is now complete. Admiral Krovex's voice came through the comm system one final time, but now it carried a tone of grudging admiration. Human, I do not understand your species. You fought an impossible battle for an outcome that benefits people you will never meet. Why? Tom considered the question while emergency lights flickered around him. Why had he stayed behind? Why had he risked everything for a transmission that might not even reach its destination? The answer seemed obvious to him, though he suspected it would confuse the hegemony commander. Admiral, someone had to hold the line. If not me, then who? If not here, then where? Sometimes you just do what needs doing because it needs doing. The station shuddered as its damaged systems finally began to fail. Tom had pushed every component far beyond its design limits, and now the accumulated stress was taking its toll. But the mission was complete. The data had been transmitted, the beacon was active, and the hegemony fleet was still floating dead in space. Tom heard the distant sound of engines approaching the station. At first he thought it might be more hegemony reinforcements, but the engine signatures were wrong. These were coalition ships, probably drawn by his beacon signal or responding to the transmitted intelligence data. Through the observation windows, Tom could see bright flashes of light as the arriving coalition fleet engaged the disabled hegemony vessels. Without their shields or weapons, the enemy ships were helpless against even a small rescue force. Admiral Krovex's mighty fleet was being systematically captured or destroyed by ships that had followed Tom's signal. The hegemony soldiers in the transmitter chamber began receiving urgent orders to evacuate. Their fleet was defeated. Their mission had failed, and their only hope was to escape before coalition reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. They looked at Tom with expressions of bewilderment and respect. unsure how to treat an enemy, who had single-handedly turned a routine conquest into a complete disaster. Tom slumped against the transmitter array as exhaustion finally claimed him. The combination of radiation exposure, combat stress, and sleep deprivation was taking its toll. But he had done it. One man with a toolkit and an absolute refusal to accept defeat had held off an entire enemy fleet long enough to complete his mission. The last thing Tom saw before unconsciousness took him was Coalition Marines storming into the transmitter chamber, their weapons driving the remaining hegemony soldiers into hasty surrender. The station's emergency beacon was still transmitting, calling more friendly ships to the battle. The line had held. When Tom finally woke up 3 days later in a Coalition medical facility, he learned that his transmission had reached 12 different fleet commanders and provided intelligence that led to a series of Coalition victories across the sector. The Battle of Epsilon 7, as military historians were already calling it, had become a turning point in the war against the hegemony. A nurse told him that reporters were calling him the engineer of Epsilon 7 and that his story was being broadcast throughout Coalition space as an example of human determination and ingenuity. Tom found the attention embarrassing. He had just done his job, the same way he had been doing it for 3 years. Admiral Krovex, now a prisoner of war, had reportedly told his interrogators that humans were the most dangerous species in the galaxy, not because of their technology or their numbers, but because they simply refused to acknowledge when they were beaten. The Admiral had recommended that the hegemony avoid further conflicts with human settlements. Tom smiled at that news as he looked out the medical facility window at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, Coalition fleets were using his intelligence, data to protect innocent worlds from conquest. Mining stations like Epsilon 7 were continuing their quiet work, defended by people who understood that some lines could never be allowed to fall. The nurse asked him what he planned to do when he recovered from his injuries. Tom thought about it for a moment, then gave the only answer that made sense to him. "I guess I'll go back to work. Somebody's got to keep the equipment running." After all, losing had never been an option he considered, and there were always more lines that needed holding.